The Royal Palace of Whitehall was one of the wonders of Renaissance Europe.
To the innocent eye, not a trace of it survives today. But in reality, parts of it exist, stitched into the buildings that make up the heart of modern government. And the shape of those buildings is determined by the shape of the lost Palace of Whitehall. The original buildings were seized from Cardinal Wolsey by Henry VIII, who set about massively expanding them. The site eventually covered 23 acres, about 10 Wembley stadiums. Running most of the length of modern Whitehall, it stretched from St James's Park in the west to the River Thames in the east. For 2.5 centuries, the palace was the centre of English court life, embellished and added to by later kings and queens from Elizabeth I to William of Orange. Dominating the palace was the great banqueting house. Today, it's the only complete building to survive from the Palace of Whitehall. When it was first built, it was designed as a venue for court masques, which were a sort of cross between the Royal Variety performance, a grand ball, and an opera. But the banqueting house can only hint at the splendour and the scale of the palace buildings which surrounded it. If I were walking along here 450 years ago with Whitehall behind me, I'd be walking through the outer courtyard of Whitehall Palace. Beneath my feet would be a cobbled surface, and to my right, a terrace running around the courtyard. And now I'm walking into the Great Hall, which started about here and rose up at least 60 feet above my head. I've just come through a small courtyard and am now walking through the Palace Chapel, which is on the site of the most secure building in Britain, the Ministry of Defence. Behind these closed doors lies the most complete Tudor section of the lost palace. In the 1930s, most of the excavated remains of the palace were demolished and built over. Only this part was preserved, moved on steel rollers 43 feet to its present site, deep underneath the Ministry of Defence. This was the wine cellar of one of the most powerful men in 16th century England, Cardinal Wolsey, and it supported, above my head, a great chamber which was, in due course, to become the guard chamber of Whitehall Palace. It's made of brick and today houses great barrels of wine, presumably stored here for defensive purposes. A stone's throw from the wine cellar, Christopher Wren redesigned the river frontage of the palace, with steps to allow the king and queen to disembark from their barge and enter the royal apartments. Incredibly, quite a large chunk of this terrace that Sir Christopher Wren built for Queen Mary still survives here in front of the Ministry of Defence, although, of course, originally it would have been covered with a garden on the top, and down here, beneath my feet, the river would have lapped the stones. You can imagine the Queen landing here at the bottom of these steps in her great carved barge and getting out with her ladies, holding her skirts up and walking up here to a great gateway which led through to her apartments. You can still see the bases of the pillars which supported the covered way that led into the Queen's apartments. Where I'm sitting now at the top of the Queen's steps is about here on this contemporary drawing. Wolsey's wine cellar and Queen Mary's steps are not the only fragments of the palace to survive. On the other side of the modern road called Whitehall, there's considerably more. On this side were the royal apartments. On the other was an extraordinary royal sports centre. This side of the palace boasted 4 tennis courts, 2 bowling alleys, and a cockpit for watching cockfights. All this survived the fire of 1698, and much of it still exists, but it's hidden, both by later building work and official secrecy. At the heart of the British civil service is the Cabinet Office. Though it might not look like it, the core of this building was constructed by Henry VIII, and its width is determined by the width of Henry VIII's great indoor tennis court. This enormous court looked like a late Gothic chapel with a high ceiling and vast windows. And because modern Whitehall has developed piecemeal around the shell of the old palace, some startling relics remain. The tennis court was over 55 feet high, and it had on each of its corners a turret. One of these survives, soaring up through 4 floors of the modern Cabinet Office buildings. turret was topped with a rather spectacular checkerboard decoration made out of squares of black flint and large blocks of chalk. On top of that was a large onion dome made out of solid stone. This small patch of grass amidst the filing cabinets and confidential memos is called Treasury Green, and on it are laid out the foundations of Henry VIII's tennis court. 400 years ago, Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn played tennis here, and they were watched by their courtiers from the windows above.
Unfortunately, there's nothing left of the cockpit or the bowling alleys, but there was another sport which the Palace of Whitehall provided for the amusement of the king and his court: hunting.
The palace had its own hunting park, today known as St James's Park. A park needed a keeper, and a keeper needed somewhere to live. He was provided with his own lodge on the site of what is today 10 Downing Street.
Britain's most famous address was built as a private house in 1667, but it wasn't until Victorian times that a British Prime Minister, Gladstone, made it his official residence.
I believe that a section of Henry VIII's park wall still survives deep inside 10 Downing Street. If I'm right, it'll be the first time anyone has ever identified it.
Margaret Thatcher completely redecorated number 10 in the 1980s. Would the Tudor wall have survived her revamp? My research suggested it had.
And this is it. For security reasons, I can't tell you precisely where in 10 Downing Street we are, but this is definitely a piece of the park wall built by Henry VIII's bricklayers in about 1531. It's been horribly repointed, it's got ugly patching in it. It doesn't look like much now, but it is nice to think that a piece of wall built by Henry VIII supports the house of the present British Prime Minister. In another room at number 10, there's a painting of Whitehall Palace done at the end of the reign of Charles II. Just behind this building here is where I am now, where Downing Street is today. Next door we have the cockpit, in which kings and queens watch cockfights. Then the great close tennis court, with its 4 turrets, crowned with domes. And beyond that, the Holbein Gate, linking the 2 sides of the palace, the state apartments with the sports centre. And finally, the great Stuart addition to Whitehall Palace, the banqueting house.
On the night of June the 4th, 1698, a catastrophic fire, started by a maid drying linen, swept through the royal apartments, reducing the nation's pride and joy to a heap of smouldering rubble.
But all the officers of state, who had formerly had quarters near the royal apartments, now the Ministry of Defence, moved across the road to Henry VIII's tennis court, bowling alley and cockpit. The move was only meant to be a temporary one, but gradually the Tudor and Stuart buildings were set up to provide more permanent offices for the cabinet and the treasury.
Looking today at Sir Charles Barry's austere classical facade of 1845, it's hard to believe